Russia's latest accusation that NATO and the European Union are waging what it calls a real war through Ukraine has reignited an already heated global debate, pushing the conflict once more into the center of international attention. The statement, delivered in sharp tones by Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov at the United Nations, comes at a time when the fighting in Ukraine continues to escalate with no clear end in sight. His words were not just aimed at Kyiv, but at the entire Western alliance, portraying the war not as a two-sided conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but as a larger confrontation with the West itself. The accusation carries heavy weight because it reframes the narrative Moscow has been presenting for over 2 years. From the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has insisted it was conducting what it called a special military operation to protect its security and sovereignty. But as NATO countries, particularly the United States, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom, have stepped up their supply of long-range missiles, artillery systems, drones, and now more advanced air defense weapons, Russia has shifted its rhetoric. Instead of portraying the war as a limited campaign, officials now claim that Moscow is under direct assault from NATO and the EU, with Ukraine serving as the battleground. For many observers, Lavrov's choice of words "real war" marks a new stage in the propaganda battle. It is designed to galvanize Russian domestic support and warn Western nations that their involvement is no longer hidden or indirect. In Moscow's narrative, every NATO missile fired from Ukrainian soil and every EU-funded military package becomes evidence that Europe and America are already at war with Russia. Russian state television has amplified this message, broadcasting footage of NATO weapons systems and highlighting casualty figures from Russian strikes on Ukrainian supply depots stocked with Western arms. On the Ukrainian side, officials immediately rejected the claim. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly argued that NATO and EU assistance is defensive, aimed at protecting Ukraine's sovereignty against an invasion that violated international law. Ukrainian diplomats at the UN described Lavrov's words as a deliberate attempt to escalate tensions and create fear among Western publics. For them, Russia's statements are part of a larger strategy to fracture Western unity and slow down the flow of aid. In their telling, if Moscow can convince ordinary Europeans that they are being dragged into a direct war, protests may rise in EU capitals and pressure governments to reconsider their commitments. The United States was quick to respond as well. Officials in Washington dismissed the accusation, calling it an inversion of reality. In their view, Russia started the war, Russia escalated it, and Russia continues to bombard civilian areas with missiles and drones. American spokespeople at the State Department argued that support for Ukraine is about defending international norms and preventing aggression from spilling into other countries. They reminded audiences that NATO troops are not fighting in Ukraine, and no Western country has officially deployed combat forces into Ukrainian territory. Instead, the assistance consists of weapons, training, intelligence, and financial aid. Still, critics point out that this distinction, while legally important, may not matter much in the realm of perception. Inside Europe, the accusation resonated differently depending on the country. In Poland and the Baltic states, Lavrov's comments were taken as further confirmation that Russia sees itself in open confrontation with the entire West. Leaders in Vilnius, Riga, Tallinn, and Warsaw have long warned that Moscow will not stop in Ukraine if it achieves victory. For them, NATO's credibility is at stake, and every shipment of arms is both a defense of Ukraine and a safeguard for their own borders. In Germany and France, however, the rhetoric raised new anxieties. Public opinion in those countries is increasingly weary of the war, worried about high energy costs, inflation, and the prospect of escalation. Analysts note that Russian accusations of real war are designed to feed exactly those fears, making populations question whether their leaders are dragging them into a conflict that could spiral out of control. At the UN itself, Lavrov's speech echoed across a chamber already divided. Some countries in the global south sympathized with Russia's portrayal, not necessarily because they support the invasion, but because they see Western double standards in global politics. Nations in Africa and Asia that have long criticized NATO's interventions in Iraq, Libya, and Kosovo find it easier to accept Moscow's framing of NATO as an aggressor. On the other hand, Western diplomats highlighted the hypocrisy of accusing NATO of war while Russia continues to occupy Ukrainian territory and launch missile attacks almost daily. The clash of narratives underscored how fragmented the international system has become, with no consensus on who holds responsibility for the ongoing bloodshed. Behind the speeches lies the stark reality on the battlefield. Ukraine continues to receive long-range ATACMS missiles from the United States and Storm Shadow cruise missiles from Britain, weapons that can hit deep into Russian-occupied territory. Recent strikes on ammunition depots, fuel storage sites, and command centers have visibly rattled Russian logistics. Moscow responds with waves of drone and missile attacks targeting Ukrainian power plants, grain storage, and urban centers. Each new strike becomes ammunition for Russia's claim that it is facing not just Ukraine but the entire Western arsenal. Analysts say this cycle feeds into a dangerous logic. The more effective Western weapons are, the louder Russia shouts about NATO's involvement, and the greater the risk of escalation. The phrase real war also carries an ominous undertone for Russians themselves. For years, the Kremlin has carefully avoided mobilizing the entire population, insisting that life should continue as normal despite the fighting. But labeling the conflict as a real war could be a prelude to broader mobilization. Some experts believe the government may use this rhetoric to justify conscription, increased military spending, or even new laws restricting dissent. In Russian history, the framing of conflict has always been central to mobilization. By declaring that the nation faces not just Ukraine but NATO and the EU, the leadership seeks to prepare society for a longer, harsher struggle. Western military officials are watching this shift with concern. If Moscow truly treats NATO as a combatant, the risk of miscalculation grows. Already, there have been incidents where Russian missiles strayed into NATO territory, as with the explosions in Poland in late 2022. If Russia believes it is in a real war with NATO, the threshold for striking supply hubs in Poland, Romania, or Slovakia could lower. Such an escalation would dramatically widen the conflict. NATO leaders insist that their deterrence is strong, with thousands of troops and advanced systems stationed along the eastern flank. Still, the shadow of escalation hangs heavy, and Lavrov's words at the UN only underline the danger. The accusation also reveals Russia's diplomatic strategy. By framing NATO and the EU as aggressors, Moscow hopes to rally potential partners like China, Iran, and North Korea. These countries, while not officially at war, have provided varying degrees of economic and military support. China continues to supply dual-use technology. Iran has provided drones, and North Korea has been accused of sending artillery shells. For Russia, painting itself as a victim of Western aggression makes it easier to justify such partnerships and to argue that the global order is divided between Western imperialism and a multipolar resistance. In Ukraine, the words have a different resonance. For soldiers on the front lines, the debate over whether NATO is directly involved feels distant compared to the daily reality of combat, yet they know that without NATO and EU support, their fight would be nearly impossible. Zelensky and his commanders regularly stress that the flow of Western weapons must not stop, no matter what Russia says at the UN. For ordinary Ukrainians, Lavrov's accusation is seen as another reminder of how their country is being used as the stage for a much larger geopolitical showdown. Civilians in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and other cities continue to live under air raid sirens, bomb shelters, and the uncertainty of whether the next missile will hit their street. The global media's coverage of the accusation reflects the polarization of narratives. In Western outlets, Lavrov's comments are often portrayed as propaganda, a sign of Russia's frustration at the effectiveness of Western weapons. In Russian and pro-Russian media, however, the phrase real war dominates headlines, with commentators declaring that the West has finally dropped its mask. The information war runs parallel to the actual fighting, shaping public opinion and influencing the decisions of leaders who must respond not only to battlefield events but also to the mood of their citizens. Ultimately, whether or not NATO and the EU are waging a real war is less about legal definitions than about perception. Russia's framing is intended to shift the moral burden, casting itself as the defender rather than the aggressor. The West rejects this narrative, arguing that the invasion was unprovoked and that all assistance is defensive. Ukraine stands in the middle, dependent on its allies but determined to maintain its sovereignty. As the conflict drags on, the danger is that such rhetoric could harden positions further, making compromise even more elusive. For now, the accusation reverberates as another escalation in the war of words that parallels the war of weapons. Russia wants the world to believe it is fighting not a smaller neighbor, but an entire alliance determined to destroy it. NATO and the EU insist they are helping a sovereign nation defend itself. Ukraine continues to fight for survival, its cities under fire and its soldiers pushing forward at great cost. In the end, whether the world views this as a local war, a proxy war, or a real war, may determine not only the outcome in Ukraine, but the stability of Europe and the future of international order itself.